military perspective, it's nice to have all those fancy ships and tanks and things like that. But we tend to forget about the societal elements and the human elements in fighting war. And really what we're seeing in Ukraine is exactly that. I mean, you have a much less sophisticated adversary with a lot less support, but you've got a world united behind the Ukrainian people, right? In their, their stance against the Russian invaders. And we're seeing that play out, right? It's not that easy to unseat a population, a society of people, right, that are motivated to protect their homeland. The U.S., right, has learned that lesson the hard way many times over our history, right? Just like the Russians have, and it's really interesting to see, what happened in Ukraine years ago, and what's happening right now. Again, I don't think anyone would have predicted this outcome from the start. So what I'd like to do today is really just make myself available to you all as you're entering into the next phase of your lives and, your careers as either a student or elsewhere. Just, what's going on in the national security arena today. So like I said, I spent, a little over 6 years in the intelligence community, mostly focused on science and technology issues. Right. So while Russia and what's going on in Ukraine is certainly a concern, from a U.S. foreign policy perspective and really our position as a world power, I'm not all that worried about Russia. Obviously, the nuclear threat and things like that make them sort of an unpredictable element. And definitely, as Putin and others in the regime feel more and more threatened, some of those tools become more, front and center in the toolkit. Right? If they're running out of tanks and ammunition and people to fight the war, right, then all of a sudden that nuclear button becomes a little bit easier to push. And I believe Keith's going to expand on that. But really, when we're thinking about, folks like you who are going on into college or out into the workforce or elsewhere, in terms of where the U.S. is in the world stage, right? China is the pacing threat. And I think before the Ukraine situation, right, that's essentially where the intelligence community was. It's important to consider Russia because they have nuclear weapons, right, and they have a history of messing around with NATO in Europe. But from a threatening to America perspective, right, we're concerned about the economy. We're concerned about an educated and active workforce. We're concerned about, how we're going to use technology to enhance our society, to fight wars, right, to bring the world together for our objectives. And China is a huge threat to that. And it's, seeing what China has been doing over the past few months during this Ukraine war, they've been kind of sitting and watching, right? They have their own territorial disputes with Taiwan, and how they see their power influence in the South China Sea as an example. So I think this is going to be a lesson that China is going to learn a lot from, and it's going to make our ability to influence, their part of the world probably a little bit harder. So going out, like I said, into college, into the workforce, right? We as a society and as a country, right, and as a nation, we've really got to be thinking about how we keep pace with our adversaries in China. And that's what I spent most of my career in the intelligence community on. Now, took sort of a circuitous path there. So I was a biology undergrad major, and I went to grad school, worked on coronaviruses before COVID and before MERS and some of those other coronaviruses that we've now heard about. But really, seeing the impact that science and technology has on our future, and really the biological sciences, biotechnology, keeping us all healthy, but also using, bacteria to make new materials and, understand how our brain works so that we can build better artificial intelligence tools. All those sorts of things drew me into the intelligence community because it was, my job to really assess what the bad guys were doing, right? And if the bad guys were using biology, right, for nefarious purposes or purposes that would make them outcompete the United States. So I don't want to take too much time. I want to answer questions. I want to talk. So I think with that, I'll turn it over to Keith to talk about the nuclear angle. But Russia is definitely a concern. Ukraine's a concern. I think having some of our Nordic partners now applying to join NATO is a good thing. But we can't really take our eye off the ball because in a lot of ways that Russian threat, more traditional type of threat that the U.S. has thought about, is a lot easier to manage, right, conceptually, and thinking about a near peer adversary. When you think about the Chinese threat and everything that they're doing, right, it's a lot harder to do. And so I don't want us to all kind of default into thinking about Ukraine when there's other, I think more pacing threats to America's, prominence on the world stage than what's going on over in Eastern Europe.
Excellent. Thank you, Andy. I appreciate that insight. And perhaps you'd be thinking about some of the technological issues that we're dealing with, particularly in this war, that you wouldn't in particular are paying attention to. Keith, if you would be willing to give a little bit of your perspective of, Andy just touched on the issue of potential nuclear escalation. From your perspective and years in the intelligence community, lots of us came out of the intelligence community here today. Where do you think we're going in that regard? Mute, unmute. You're also.
There we go. How's that? Is that a little better?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for this time to spend with you. It's a privilege. My teaching years at Stanford University and then later at Sierra Nevada College were really golden years of trying to pass on to the next generation as much information and insight as possible, so that when you get into positions of influence, wherever they may be, that you have a better understanding of why we are where we are today. And that's a big question. You need to ask the why question all the time. Why? Because there's a lot of background, a lot of water that's gone over the dam before your generation, even before my generation, that influences why the world is the way it is today. Now, I spent most of my career working strategic nuclear issues. I was 30 years in the Naval Reserve Program, worked for the Department of State, and worked for Central Intelligence, Director of Central Intelligence. I spent most of my time negotiating nuclear treaties overseas, starting with SALT II. And forgive me if I use acronyms that you don't understand. Raise your hand if I say something you don't understand, because there's no point in going on in confusion. That was in the 70s. In the 80s, I got involved in the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, INF, treaty negotiation. And in the 90s and in the early 2000s, negotiating and implementing the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, trying to ban nuclear testing globally forever. So that's been my experience. And then in the teaching arena, I really taught trying to help students understand national security issues, particularly nuclear issues, the efforts we've made to constrain and control and eliminate nuclear weapons. It's been quite a journey. I'm a cold warrior. Okay, I was influenced by Sputnik that went up in 1957, the first artificial satellite launched by the Russians, not by the US. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 62, which was really a very, very frightening experience. I remember going home from a meeting in high school. I was a senior that year, and telling my buddy who I dropped off, I may never see you again, because we were hunkered down thinking the atom bomb may come and take us all out overnight. It was very, very scary. Then we got into the Cold War, highlighted, and I spent 6 months working in the Soviet Union in 1969. And my job was to talk to the Soviet people, explain about the US, and understand what they were thinking and what they're concerned about. So I got a pretty good insight on that. And, I was a Soviet specialist, Russian language, et cetera, et cetera. I spent many years negotiating within the intelligence community, national intelligence estimates, trying to figure out what Soviet strategic nuclear forces were capable of doing and how they might choose to use them. Then I got into the arena of trying to negotiate limitations on those weapons and eventually how to eliminate them as best we could. What I would encourage you to do is keep in mind, in addition to asking always the why question, for example, Why did Putin decide to launch an attack into Ukraine? Why do the Ukrainians react the way they do? Why does NATO react the way it does? Why does the US react the way it does? A lot of why questions, very important to get to the bottom of it. And keep in mind, as an intelligence officer professional, my job is to try to figure out where the other guy is coming from, not promoting US policy in reaction to it or to preempt it, but to try to figure out where is the opposition coming from? Why are they doing what they are doing? You've always got to try to get below the surface, peel back the layers of the onion to try to find out what is motivating certain actions. And keep in mind, what happens today didn't just happen because it's today. It happened because of things that happened 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 100 years ago. All right, it's all related. Everything is a prologue for the next chapter of life. So you got to keep that in mind. You got to really dig down to understand more deeply than superficially from the news what's going on and why is it happening the way it is. On the nuclear issue per se, yes, Vladimir Putin has suggested the nuclear threat in retaliation for the sanctions, et cetera, et cetera. But you have to say, why would he use nuclear weapons in this context? What are nuclear weapons used for? They're used as a deterrent to prevent somebody else from taking out your country or from launching a devastating strike against you. They're not battlefield weapons. You don't throw nuclear weapons into the battlefield at a place like Ukraine and expect it to work. It's not going to achieve anything except bring catastrophe on Ukraine. And as Bob Gates, former Secretary of Defense and Director of Central Intelligence, said on Face the Nation on Sunday, Russia is going to suffer as much as Ukraine if nuclear weapons are used, because where are the prevailing winds? They go from west to east. So any nuclear contamination unleashed on Ukraine's going to contaminate a large swath of Russian territory. So does it make sense for them to use nuclear weapons? I'd say no, it doesn't make sense at all. Now, if for some reason the Ukrainian forces were threatening Moscow and they were on the border, as one time a few other forces have been, then as last desperation act, maybe they would launch their nuclear weapons, but certainly not to fight a ground war in Ukraine. It makes no sense strategically or tactically whatsoever. But it scares people. And that's what Putin's trying to do. He's trying to put us on notice. Look, I've got a nuclear arsenal. You mess with me, and I may decide to use it. Well, if he's really crazy, he might, for sure. Or if he's really desperate, he might, but not in a logical sense. And of course, that's one of the questions you have to ask yourself: is the opposition logically thinking the way we think? And don't assume that they do. They have a different calculation. So the first question I want you to say is, why did Putin go into Ukraine? Why did Ukraine react the way it has? Why has NATO reacted the way it has, or not acted? These are really, really important questions, okay? So you can set the nuclear aside, and I'd say don't worry about it, particularly. Don't forget about it, but don't worry about it. And really ask more basic questions. What's really going on in this European context? What's the historical antecedent to all this? There's a long history between the Russians and the Ukrainians. And it didn't just happen during your lifetime or during Putin's time at the helm of Russia. So I really want you guys to think about that, and then think about potential outcomes. In the intelligence community, we never say this is what's going to happen. Because why? Nobody knows what's going to happen. We can guess, we can have educated guesses, but what we try to do is say, here are the variety of potential outcomes of a conflict or of potential moves a country might make, from least likely to most likely. And then you give your rationale for your judgment of why it's more or less likely. but nobody knows. So for policymakers, when you're trying to suggest to policymakers in the White House and in the National Security Council, what should they do? You have to say, here's the array of potential outcomes you have to deal with. And now you've got to define some policies that will steer you in one direction or the other, because nobody knows exactly how it's going to unfold. We don't know how this conflict is going to unfold in the end result. I have my guesses. You probably have your guesses too. But I'll give you what mine is, and that is that Russia will control its land bridge from Russian territory to the Crimea. Why? Because the Crimea is critical to Russia's national security. And they had to go through Ukrainian territory to get there, by land at least. The Russian Empire, back in the 18th and 19th centuries, strived to have a warm water naval port. That's the Crimea. It's always been the kingpin of Russian, earlier Soviet naval power. It's access to the Mediterranean and to the Atlantic without having to go through the Murmansk area up in the north. So there you go. Thank you, Maureen. So now you see, after having gone after Kiev and failed to take it over, Russia now is focusing on this land bridge to the Crimea. And I believe at the end of the day, what we're likely to have is a truncated Ukraine national entity that has by de facto lost part of its territory to Russia. Now, Russia also wants particularly to ensure that Ukraine does not become a member of NATO. Maureen, can you show the slide that has all that blue on it, showing the expansion of NATO?
Yeah.
One of the things that happened after the end of the Cold War was Russia wanted to make sure in the early days of the 90s that we did not expand NATO up to its border. And certain assurances were made to Russia that we would not do that. However, we were trumped by the former East European countries that had been part of the Soviet Warsaw Pact, and they clamored to become members of NATO for protection against Russia. And so you see from the Baltics all the way down to Ukraine, you see these countries that were formerly under the Soviet thumb now want protection through NATO against Russia. Ukraine was the last piece, and there was a growing sentiment in Ukraine to join NATO. Okay, keep going, farther down, 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 down. There you go. Up, back, 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 back. There you go. Look at all that blue. Next to the Russian Federation, next to Belarus, next to Ukraine, and on down. That eastward expansion of NATO is not a threat to Russia, because NATO is not a threatening offensive alliance. It's a deterrent and defensive alliance. But if you're in Russia looking westward, it doesn't look so benign. So if Ukraine had fallen into that NATO bloc, look what that would have meant to Russia's border on NATO. All that eastern segment of Ukraine that borders on Russia would now be NATO.
And now all this is likely to be NATO.
And now we're looking at Finland and Sweden. One of the unintended consequences of Putin's move into Ukraine is he has stimulated these two countries to desire to join NATO, again, to defend themselves against Russian aggression. Now, Russia is not necessarily an aggressive country, unlike the Soviet Union, which tried to conquer the world by its theology and ideology and so on. But Russia is a country that has a long history of suffered from attacks from the West, as well as attacks from the East. So you have to understand from Russia's perspective, it is a threat. Even though we say we're not threatening you, okay, but you're not Russian. You haven't lived through Russian history. You have to understand the Russian mentality and the Russian psyche and the Russian sensitivity. And the Russians have been complaining about this eastward move of NATO for a couple of decades now. And finally, Putin said, that's it. We're drawing a red line. Ukraine may never join NATO. And I will demonstrate my resolve by attacking Ukraine with military force to ensure that it does not join NATO. Now, that was his original intent, but he has not succeeded in doing that. In fact, he succeeded in unifying Ukraine, even some of the eastern regions, because nationalism is one of the most powerful forces in world history. Nationalism. And the Ukrainians have discovered in spades that they are Ukrainians. They are not Russian. And the Russians treat them as kid brothers and second-class citizens, and the Ukrainians say, enough of that, we're not going to take it. So they're fighting for their existence. And when you fight for your existence, it's hard for an attacker to succeed in overcoming them. So I think with that, I have probably outspent my time. Sorry, Maureen, but let's open it up for questions, because I hope that I've stimulated your thinking about how to dig in a little deeper on this and try to figure out what in the world is going on and where may it end up. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Keith.
So students in class, if you can say it loud enough so we can hear, or say it to Maureen, and in Mr. Keevy's class, if you want to talk to Mr. Keevy and give him your question, and those joining us virtually, if you want to type it in the chat or just put your hand up, and we can do it that way. So with that, questions.
Ladies first. There you go.
In terms of national security, I know you mentioned that the nuclear threat isn't as much of a concern as of right now, but what are some national security concerns that you guys have for the US in particular with regards to Russian interaction?
Okay, I'm sorry, with your mask on, it was too muffled. I couldn't hear.
So she said, you mentioned that the nuclear threat may not be as much of a concern. What are the concerns that we currently have with Russia in terms of national security threats? So,
Okay,
Keith, you want to
from my perspective, we have to keep remembering that Russia has, second to the United States, the largest strategic nuclear arsenal in the world. As long as there are logical, level-headed leaders in Moscow, those weapons will never be used to harm us. But can we be sure that there will always be level-headed, reasonable people in Moscow? Putin certainly raises the question, doesn't it? So we need to be concerned. They are the ones that could annihilate the United States, all right? China has a more modest nuclear force. And then there are other countries that have, bits and pieces of nuclear weapons capability, but only Russia could really wipe out the United States. So we have to pay attention to Russia, and we have to be concerned that we monitor what's going on with those forces. And I would hope that we follow on the New START treaty with additional treaties that would help regulate the growth, if not the elimination or further elimination of those forces. So we need to pay attention to it, but they're not an existential threat to the United States.
So we differentiated between the use of tactical nuke in Russia versus our concern, national security concern about the strategic nuclear threat from Moscow. Those are the nuclear weapons that could be launched or from a submarine or a missile and delivered to the United States. Okay, so
Hey, Maureen, if I can, I want to add to that too. So, in addition to the nuclear weapon of mass destruction threat, We've seen Russia use chemical weapons in recent history, right? Whether it's to poison dissidents like Navalny, whether it's on NATO territory, right? In the United Kingdom with what happened in Salisbury back in 2018. And, I think COVID's really illustrated what sort of disruption something like a biological threat can bring, both to society as well as to the battlefield. And so I think those are concerns that from a US perspective we have and a NATO perspective, because we don't have a respond in kind type of deterrent. Keith talked about deterrence and, mutually assured destruction. And the fact that we both have all these nuclear weapons means it's unlikely we're ever going to use them on each other. But if Russia were to use a chemical or a biological weapon, for example, the US's, kind of response has always been, well, we'll just use nuclear, right? And that will keep someone from using a chemical or biological weapon on the United States. But we have forces deployed in Europe, right? Our allies are there. And so these sort of third country type employments of these weapons make it really tricky. We saw this in Syria as an example, right? The Russians supported the Syrian regime who used chemical weapons in the Middle East to fight in a civil war there. And we didn't really have a good red line established or a good response in terms of how we would, the US and our allies, how we would respond to the employment of these types of weapons. So those are things that are kind of below that nuclear threshold where from a national security policy perspective, we haven't really defined what those options look like.
Yeah, Andy, I think that, thank you for speaking up. I wanted to come back to you as well, because speaking about the China aspect, the Russia-China axis, if you will, in the post-Cold War era has been quite important and has been a threat to US national security concerns because of the economic, I say, mutual hanging we have with the Chinese. We can't live with each other. We can't live without each other at this point. And the more that the Chinese and the Russians were kind of ganging up on the US because they were reacting to the US being seen as now the lone superpower in the world, and they had to counter us somehow. So we need to pay attention. And this is one point I wanted to make, and I appreciate you bringing up China, Andy, because in the face of something like the Russia-Ukraine war, we can't take our eye off the other threats that are out there, whether it be, God forbid, China going after Taiwan or anything else. There are other threats that are out there, and the cyber threat, which is certainly a significant one from Russia as well as from other countries. So there are a number of levers that Putin has and the Russians have to make our life fairly uncomfortable. And we have to be able to deal with those and not lose sight of them. It's always a danger in Washington. You get uni-focused on the most immediate crisis, but there are other things out there that are going to bite you if you don't pay attention to them.
Excellent. Thank you, Keith. We have lots and lots of questions. So to our two speakers, please keep your answers short, if you can. You're next, and go project.
So I know that China and Russia are kind of becoming
You're talking to that speaker.
are becoming problems.
Stand and deliver.
They're becoming an issue right now, and I want to ask if you think that the alliance of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa is becoming a problem or a potential threat to NATO.
Akshay, stop being obnoxious and just ask your question, please.
So if I'm hearing the question correctly, it was Brazil, Russia, India, China, the BRICS alliance. Is that something we need to be concerned about?
Yeah.
Yes. So, in terms of a non, military standpoint from an economic perspective, absolutely. It is interesting, though, with what's happened with COVID and China's sort of stance on that, and now Russia's war in Ukraine, if we might see some distancing from Brazil. We have seen it from India, right? From sort of that traditional group of, economic partners. And that's an opportunity, right? And that's an opportunity, like Keith mentioned, that we have to keep our eye on to really, bring in countries like Brazil and India more into, our sort of sphere of influence. And that's where, what's happened over the past, 6 years with the State Department and things like that, we've lost some of that ability, some of the, ability for our diplomats and our folks around the world to really build these partnerships. And so that's really important for us to be looking at in the future. You talk about rare earth minerals, energy, Brazil and India especially have so much capacity in those areas as well as in manufacturing that they could, by the US, for example, investing in their infrastructure, could help wean us off China, right, and other countries from an economic perspective.
Excellent, thank you. Mr. Keavy, did you have a question from your classroom?
Yeah, Hayden's got a question. Go ahead, Hayden. Next one up. What would happen if Ukraine joined NATO?
What would happen if Ukraine joined NATO? Well, you could have Russia trying to conquer all of Ukraine. I mean, that was part of the initial plan, I believe, to get control of Kiev, to put in a government in Ukraine that would beat to Russia's drum. So I think if there were a serious move by Ukraine to join NATO, you would have a serious reaction, more serious than we've had from Russia. Now, take in mind, it doesn't just happen overnight. It is a process. And we're already seeing what happened with Finland, with Russia cutting off the gas and the threats that are going back and forth. We have seen what happens when Turkey says no to Sweden and Finland. All right. So there's a multi-dimensional issue. And what is Turkey's problem? It's a potential Kurdistan. That's what their problem is. It has nothing to do with Russia going into Ukraine. It has nothing to do with Sweden and Finland joining NATO. It has to do with those countries supporting the people in Eastern Turkey who would like to be independent of Turkey. So this thing kind of snowballs in terms of its implications. So you have to keep digging below. What's going on? Why does Erdogan say what he says, et cetera, et cetera?
Excellent, thank you, Keith.
Is it okay if I type it out?
I
I
can-
can speak it or I can.
Speak it and I'll repeat it.
Okay, do you think that the recent monkeypox outbreak will affect the Ukrainian, Russia conflict?
Okay, so Andy, this one is for you. Question is, do you think the outbreak of monkeypox that we've seen recently is going to have any impact on the issue, the war between Russia and Ukraine?
So that's a great question. Extremely current, right? So I think you can look at parallels in other, civil war type conflicts or really, neighbors fighting each other. You can look back to the Middle East, whether it's Yemen with Saudi Arabia, or whether it's within Syria and Iraq. When you go to war and there's war right in your neighborhoods where you live, one of the first things to go is really the public health infrastructure. And so the potential impact of something like a monkeypox outbreak and spread of those cases into Ukraine could potentially have a huge impact. Right? You've got Russian soldiers in those areas who are likely immunized against smallpox, which would prevent them from getting monkeypox. And you have a susceptible population there in Ukraine who are not only don't have access to healthcare, but are maybe malnourished, right? They're out in the elements, they're stressed out, they're fighting this war. So yeah, infectious diseases have played a huge role in the outcomes of these sorts of conflicts in the past. It remains to be seen how well monkeypox is going to be able to get into Ukraine. But if you do have a few cases that become imported or you have some travel both in and out of Ukraine, I think you do have the potential for something that would be much less controllable than it is in other parts of Europe.
Thank you, Andy. Mr. Keavy, do you have another question from your class? Quiet from across.
Maureen, the lady, the young gal to your right has her hand up.
Okay.
To your right.
Oh, That right. Okay, go ahead.
So do you think the recent conflict with Russia has demonstrated that NATO should lower their standards of entry for nations?
Okay, so the question is, do you think that the conflict has indicated that NATO should change the standards of entry for membership? Keith?
Not being a member of NATO myself, it really depends on the membership of NATO. Everybody has had to earn their membership going through certain hoops. And those hoops typically are important to go through. So I don't know that there's any advantage of short circuiting that system. It might help you in one instance and might cause you a problem in another. So you have to be careful when you start changing the rules that countries have to abide by and the hoops they have to go through to join an organization such as NATO. So you got to be really careful about that.
Yes, and there's been a lot of discussion about second tiering systems in NATO, and it's been pretty clear that all the countries in NATO have the Article 5, right, protections. So once you issue Article 5 protection, you have to meet a pretty high bar to get there. But certainly it'll be, watch this space. You're in a very exciting time to watch 2 countries probably coming into NATO in the next few months.
Yeah, and that Article 5 is so important to keep your eye on, because that is an important commitment that all members of NATO have made, and they hope they'll never be tested.
So Article 5 says that if you attack one member, you've attacked them all. And we will respond. So that is what was invoked in Afghanistan that got NATO to go into Afghanistan after we were attacked on 9/11. NATO went in invoking Article 5 because we, the US, had been attacked.
And if I may, Maureen, just add, and that's something that Putin and the Russians are thinking about also. If they should probe the Baltics, for example, what would that create in terms of a reaction on NATO? Can they count on Article 5 actually being operationalized or not? That's an uncertainty that the Russians have to deal with.
Yeah, and Keith, right? I mean, one of the critical pieces, there is a tiering within NATO, an unspoken tiering. Sure, if you attack the UK, right, you might draw a different response than if you probe at the outer edges of NATO. And so it's a very delicate political issue internal to NATO, because that's that wall, right? I mean, and if Russia probes it, right, and that response isn't universal, like Turkey might object to some of these things, for example, then NATO as a concept kind of falls apart. So it is a very delicate, right, tightrope that NATO walks as well as what Russia walks.
We had a question in the chat that says, do you think there will ever be a national security issue that would necessitate or justify the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus?
Okay, which of you 2 experts are going to take that one?
Let Keith go first.
Oh, thanks, Andy. Appreciate it. Well, let's give a little historical perspective. What happened after Pearl Harbor in 1941? Okay. One can never predict how the US is going to react to a threat to itself, okay? And so I would never say never in any of these situations, because as much as revisionist historians look back and said how bad we were and what we did to the Japanese Americans, and I think it was bad. I have good friends who were born in one of those camps, okay? But the thing is, when you're at risk and you're not sure whether the existence of your country is going to survive the threat, you take extreme measures. We saw this after 9/11 with the Patriot Act, which has been walked back to a certain degree. So you have to just understand, you don't know what you're going to do until you're faced with a situation.
Excellent. Thank you, Keith. Okay. Question?
Okay. In terms of future interactions with Russia, how do you think the war on Ukraine will impact US negotiations and whatnot?
So Andy, I'm gonna ask you to address that, but address it in the context of future negotiations on potentially chem, bio, or nuclear issues.
Yeah, I'll be real quick because I think he has some to weigh in here also.
I'm sorry, I really didn't hear the question.
Okay, I'll repeat it. That's okay. Andy, you answer and I'll repeat.
Okay.
Will the war have an impact on future negotiations with Russia?
Yeah, we're in a perilous situation when it comes to those treaties and the future negotiations, right? I mean, Russia is a party to the chemical and biological warfare conventions. The issue there is that they're pretty easily circumvented, especially for something like the Biological Weapons Convention. There's almost no enforcement mechanisms there, and the attribution is very difficult. And we saw this in Syria with the employment of nerve and other chemical agents. It's hard to tie them back to an actor, right? Even if they're used in a country, right, in a certain battle space. And so, the verification measures and the enforcement measures for those treaties are minimal to begin with. And even with, Russia via, investigation mechanisms having employed chemical weapons, right? We don't have a lot of open negotiations currently with them on those sorts of issues, but I'll let Keith expand on the nuclear side as well.
Okay, Keith, you have 1 minute.
59 seconds.
59
Okay. I agree with Andy that the verification measures, particularly in the chemical weapons ban, is very weak. It's only as good as countries, member states of particular treaty are willing to make it. And, Russia was a major violator of the Biological Weapons Convention many years into its existence. So cheating is something that countries typically do when they feel it's in their national security interests and requires them to do so. So verification is ultimately the most important weapon we have to prevent the use of these things, because we need to monitor what is going on. And it is difficult if countries are unwilling to allow the kind of intrusive monitoring that's required to catch the cheating.
Excellent. Okay, so we are 1 minute out. Thank you all. Congratulations again to the We the People team. Thank you very much, Mr. Keavy, for having your class join us. And thank you to our two speakers. All of the recordings for these sessions will be posted on the NSF website by tomorrow. So you can watch this or the other sessions. There was a lot of other different types of discussion. And go save the world.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Keith.
Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Good
you,
luck.
Andy. Good to be on here with you.
Bye, class. See you tomorrow.
See